right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be in the world today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend this latest bootcamp session, Mastering Sales Success. This time we're focusing on conducting assessments that yield result. This is actually part 2 of a 3-part bootcamp series that I started last week, focused on the MSP sales process. So the premise of it was last week that your marketing worked, because we spent January talking about lead gen and marketing and how to fill the top part of your funnel. And then in February, the assumption was that your marketing worked and you now have prospects that want to meet with you. So last week's bootcamp was really focused on that initial discovery meeting. What's the best questions to ask? What's the flow of the questions that you should be asking them in, really to try and find out if there's a good fit between your MSP and their business. And then the outcome of that initial discovery meeting is moving ahead to the second stage of the sales process, where you need to do some additional fact finding. You need to start building your story, building your case, so that you can create a compelling proposal when you get to the negotiation and closing stage that your hopefully your prospect will sign. So today we're focusing on part 2 of that sales process, where you're doing the data collection, doing that assessment. So if you haven't attended any of my boot camps in the past, my name is Stephanie Hammond. I am the head nerd here at Enable that's responsible for all things sales and marketing related. I've been with Enable for a little while, since 2004, had a lot of different roles during my tenure. So you can see my contact information there on the screen, my email address. I'm on LinkedIn, so if you're on LinkedIn, we should be linked together. So looking at the core objectives that we're going to cover off in today's session, we're really going to be focusing on the benefits of following a proper prospect assessment process and why you want to implement a repeatable process like this if this is something that you're not really doing today, or if you're not conducting assessments on a consistent basis. And so we're going to talk about the different steps that make up the prospect assessment process, focusing on what happens at each step, and then really outlining why it's really critical that we want to be thorough and not rush through or skip any of these steps. Today's session is really going to be focused on the theory, and I really do want to stress that. It's going to be focused on the theory, the processes behind conducting your assessments. This is tools agnostic. I'm not going to be going into any tools. I'm not going to be pitching any tools for you to use to deliver, conduct your assessments. This is really going on why we want to do them, what are the steps, what are the questions, what's the data that we want to collect, and I basically leave it up to you to figure out what tools you want to use to do that data collection stage. So I like to kind of say that off at the very beginning, because some people come to this boot camp thinking I'm going to be pitching a tool that Enable has, and we don't. I'm not. This is not a tool sale. This is pure theory that I'm going to be talking about today. And what I am going to go through, if you've never done anything like this before, it's very detailed, and it's probably you're thinking that, wow, this is a lot of manual work, you know, and what I'm going through is a very thorough assessment process. But in speaking to MSPs that do assessments often, it's just part of their sales process. They helped me kind of create this boot camp about 18 months ago when I first started delivering it. They said that in the beginning, theirs was a very manual process as well, because they kind of had to get their steps figured out. And then once they knew what it was that they needed to collect, that's when they knew what kind of tools that they needed to purchase to insert to kind of help automate a lot of that data collection process. So once they had the good structure and the good manual process in place, that's when they started investing in the tools. And so it's a good thing if maybe you're a smaller MSP that's you know listening to me today, and maybe you don't have the budget to go out and purchase a whole bunch of set of tools. The focus of this will just be talking about, well, what should the steps be? What should you be focusing on? And then, you know, once you have a good handle on that and you have some budget, then, you know, go ahead and look at the tools after that. So let's start off, what are the key components that make up your prospect assessment process? And there's really two parts that I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the business review and the workflow assessment. And this is where we're going to be talking to the key stakeholders. If we weren't able to really talk to everybody in that initial discovery phase, ideally you should be having everybody, all those key stakeholders in that first meeting. But if for some reason you're not, or you didn't get the full picture, then this is where you really want to kind of double back and make sure that you are now having the opportunity to talk to all the key stakeholders to find out, the what, the where, the when, the how, they use the technology that they have and how that really fits into, whatever role they're playing within the organization. This is where we want to find out what's working well, what's preventing them from reaching their departmental goals, what challenges are they experiencing, what are their priorities, and what would they love to see fixed if you can kind of wave that magic wand. And then the second part is that cybersecurity and data risk assessment process. I'm going to be basing this on the CIS controls because it is the more globally accepted framework of standards that's out there. Globally, if you look at any of the other in any of the other countries in Europe and in APAC and Australia, everybody pretty much references the CIS controls. So I have built the cybersecurity assessment off of these CIS controls. And we want to deliver some sort of cybersecurity and data risk assessment as part of this step, because you want to determine what holes exist with the prospects, security policies, their procedures. Even if they have them in place at all, they may not, because depending on who they're using today as their current MSP, that MSP may not have stuff like this in place. And then you also want to determine what holes may exist, what gaps may exist in their just overall cybersecurity protection coverage. Are there any holes or gaps in their cyber resiliency capabilities that could potentially place their data, their intellectual property at risk should they fall victim to an attack? And so we're going to break each of these down into more details to kind of give you a complete overview of each step. And as I said, it's really critical that we don't skip any of these steps. It might be tempting, especially if you come across those impatient buyers who, maybe they're ready to sign today, fantastic. But I still encourage you to go through this step. Don't rush through it, because if you do skip through it, if you do rush through it, there's a chance that you could miss something, right? And there's something that you can maybe miss the opportunity to mitigate a certain risk, whether that be your risk or maybe that's your prospect's risk, or you can even miss out on some additional revenue opportunities if we're rushing through this. Because every single prospect is at risk for a cyber attack, just given the fact that attacks are much more complex, they're more sophisticated, they're more targeted now than they ever been before. When you think about what, the goal of an attack is, right? The goal of an attack is to extract money from your prospect's business in any way possible. And so we want to be disciplined in this approach. We want to be patient as we're going to go through it, but we do want to be thorough. We want to use this process again to identify all of those risks that are present in your prospect's network, the risks that are in their business environment, so you can then show value and the level of expertise that you are bringing to the table if the prospect partners with you. And so by implementing the appropriate services, the programs, based on how you've designed your cybersecurity programs, those are designed to reduce your prospect's risk. And by doing that, it's also going to reduce your risk as the MSP as well. So again, just a cautionary note that, if we rush through this, we're not going to get that critical data that we do need to help us put together that compelling proposal when we get to step 3. And that's the whole reason why, we need to differentiate ourselves. We need to really expose our value to prospects who just think we might be like any other MSP out there. And this process that I'm taking you through over these next 3 weeks is helping to build up that value and really help set you apart as a different type of MSP in terms of how you run and manage your business. I do have a quick poll because I am curious for everybody that is on the line today. If you do offer assessments today, do you charge for your assessments? And sometimes it's a controversial question. So yes, we do, no, we don't, or it depends, or we don't conduct any pre-sales assessment. So I just kind of have 4 options there. Everybody was very quick with their voting this morning. Thank you. So it looks like, I'll just close that off. So it looks like we have nobody charging for their assessments. Okay, interesting. And then a third say, no, we don't charge. Another third say, it depends. And another third say that we don't conduct pre-sales assessments. Okay, all fair enough. So hopefully, for those that aren't doing any pre-assessments, pre-sales assessments today, that maybe think about starting it, because again, it all comes down to creating a compelling proposal. And you can only create a compelling proposal if you build a story and you have something to tell, and your initial discovery meeting that you have, with your prospect, following it up with this assessment, that's helping you give, kind of the bullet points of your story so that you can come up with that justification around why you are the better MSP and why they should switch over to you. But going to, the assessments and should you be charging, given what I'm going to be talking about, this morning, my belief is that you should be charging your prospects for assessments. And I say this because if you implement what I'm going to be talking about today, this is going to take a lot of work. It's going to be significant work. Even when you get the tools in place, it's going to take some time to complete, and it will likely require the skills of your best employees. And so you want to be properly compensated for those efforts. Also, it's psychological. Whether you charge for this or not, it sends a huge message to your prospect on should they value your expertise or not. Because when you have to pay for something, it naturally tends to hold an increased value in someone's eyes. And so the goal of the assessment is really to show your prospect how much risk they have in their business and how much they deviate from, your technology and cybersecurity standards and best practices, and how that could be impacting the productivity and the safety of their employees, which then impacts the revenue generating capabilities of the organization as a whole. So the assessment is that opportunity to really position yourself as that expert, as that authority in the space, and then you use your cybersecurity and technology standards. I don't want to say you weaponize it, but you use that as your differentiator from other MSPs out there who aren't doing anything like this, or maybe to this extent. And so if you don't charge for your assessments, my feeling is that prospects, they'll never really understand or appreciate that. So my feeling is that you should charge for them. And when you don't charge or conduct an assessment in the first place, or you don't charge for them, you're kind of taking on a gamble on 2 fronts, because without an assessment, you could end up inheriting, a chaotic, old, poorly configured IT infrastructure, which will then make it very challenging for you to support profitably. If you didn't factor kind of this aging network into your monthly contract costs. And if you don't charge for your assessments, then the prospect is really then free to kind of take that assessment report, if you do them, and all that free consulting that you basically provided them, and then go back to maybe their existing MSP, or maybe take it to another MSP that they might be evaluating, give them the report, and then just ask them for a cheaper quote to remediate the work. Also, by charging for your assessment, that is what kind of signals the commitment to engage, from both sides, from the prospect that they're serious in potentially working with you and establishing that partnership with you. And then, from you to the prospect, that you're making a commitment to take this step seriously as well, and that you're equally as motivated to kind of start that partnership with them, using your best, most qualified resources to demonstrate that commitment. And if anybody reads, the service leadership reports, very enlightening, but not light reading. But, from the 2022 Service Leadership Report, they found that MSPs that charge for their assessments during that pre-sales process experience, they're actually generating 1.5 times higher profitability than those MSPs that don't charge for their assessment. And their feeling is that because MSPs that do charge for their assessments, they end up attracting a higher quality, more strategic type of prospect who more than likely will conform to meet your higher technology and security standards that really we should be enforcing across all of our customers. And so by charging for your assessment in the pre-sale stage, that is what's really going to hopefully help eliminate those price sensitive or those cost conscious types of buyers from your prospect pool, and hopefully leave behind those prospects that really want to work with you and that you really do want to have as clients. Because if a prospect is willing to pay for your assessment, they're more than likely going to be willing to pay what you're charging for the services that you offer. So, as you're conducting this stage of the MSP sales process, there might be a couple of comments that you may get that you want to be prepared for from your prospect. As if you tell them that you do charge for assessments, the prospect may come back and say, well, I'm considering a couple of other MSPs. They're not charging for their assessments. Why should I pay yours and go with you? So I thought it might be helpful just to quickly prepare some scripted responses. Feel free to take a screenshot of these because unfortunately I'm not able to email out our presentations. Marketing and legal won't let us. So I always just say anything that you like, just kind of take a screenshot of it. So if the prospect comes back and says, you know what, I'm looking at some other ones, they're not charging me, why should I pay yours? A possible response could be that saying, yes, a lot of my competitors do offer a free assessment. But if you think about it, to offer it for free, they're likely sending their least talented IT person to do the work, who may not be well-versed or well-trained in the area of cybersecurity. And in the interest of time, they're keeping it short. They're probably just scratching the surface when it comes to cybersecurity, where in contrast, our assessments, they're conducted jointly by a business analyst and a technical analyst. They work together to really assess the safety and the security of your overall network infrastructure, because our goal is to help our customers avoid becoming an attack target. And so our assessment is designed to highlight deficiencies in your network so we can put a plan together of corrective actions. And this whole process, it just requires a level of expertise and proficiency that our prospects are willing to pay for. Because again, going back to if you just offer them for free, in a lot of people's minds, there's not a lot of worth attached to a free assessment. And if you don't place a value on it, then it's hard to really get your prospect to kind of see a value on it. And your time is valuable. You are a professional, and I truly believe that you should be treated as such. When you think about what a professional is, professionals are experts in their field. They charge for their services. They charge for their advice and their guidance. Excuse me. And a lot of times they don't give away their time and their expertise away for free. So by having your prospect pay for your assessment, it means that they're serious about engaging with you and they're serious about wanting to solve their current predicament. And if you don't request payment, then I feel also the relationship can kind of become a little bit lopsided and imbalanced. You could put in all this time and energy, and then, the prospect could ghost you without warning. But by requesting that payment, you are signaling that you're taking this engagement just as seriously and that you're doing what you can to solve their problems in the most efficient and effective means possible. So we want to look at, using this as an opportunity to turn your assessment process into a competitive advantage in your market. Or you may have the prospect come back and say, you know what, this really seems a bit excessive. You know, is it all really necessary? So another possible response, if you hear this, is really kind of talking about, you know, times have changed, right? Many businesses, they've never put money into their IT like they are now, but this is necessary because the hackers, the bad guys, the threat actors, they're just way too smart now, especially with, you know, AI and what they can do with that, right? Because it isn't about if they're going to get breached, but it is about when. And so we want to make sure that we can get your data back, that we can get your business back online as quickly as possible when that happens. And so we want to be able to identify all of the holes and all of the gaps in your current network setup so that we can identify your true risk exposure. And then that will then allow us to determine what the best course of action is going to be and what the best suite of services are going to be to help reduce and mitigate your risk exposure. That's going to make your employees and your organization better protected and secure. And so that's why all of this is necessary, because we can't protect what we don't know about. And so we do need to be thorough. So just a couple of objections that, you know, you've probably heard and maybe give you some things to think about on how you can respond back to that. And then I think I do talk about it later on in the boot camp, but one of the questions that I get is, well, if I do charge for it, you know, can I get that money back? And so, yeah, I've seen partners, they charge for it up front and then say, if you sign on, you know, we'll give you a credit back, we'll pay you back for it, we'll give you a discount off your monthly fee. Like, there's ways that you can work around helping the prospect recuperate whatever they're spending on your assessment, you know, if they become a client. But then if for whatever reason they don't become a client, you've done that work, at least you've been properly compensated for that work. So let's look at the first of the two parts we're going to be talking about today, the business review and the workflow assessment. And so when we talk about the business review workflow assessment, this is our objective, our unbiased analysis of your prospect's business that's really designed to provide kind of that clear picture of where your prospect's business currently stands today, where it's going, and then what factors are impeding or might be impeding that growth. And so the goal with this is to really gauge, you know, how well is your prospect at managing and executing in those areas that might be impacting their bottom line or might be hindering their growth, to really see where you can insert, you know, your services to meet their growth and business objectives. And so the goal here is to really get an understanding around how does that organization make money? And if you can, it might be a little bit difficult, but if you can try during your review process to find out what that revenue structure looks like, that will really be beneficial, because then it will give you insight as to how much revenue could potentially be at risk if they fail to implement, you know, some of the proper protection protocols that you're likely going to be recommending, if you find that, you know, their existing MSP might not, you know, they might be a little bit laxed in that area. Also, part of this section, we're going to want to gain an understanding of the prospects, their goals, their objectives, review what their current and their future plans are to grow that business further, because through your assessment, you're going to want to highlight, are there any limitations that are currently present in their technology setup that might make that desired growth that they're looking to achieve a little bit more challenging for them, or maybe unrealistic for them if they don't make changes to their technology infrastructure. And so this is where you're going to be able to use that information to come up with your recommendations that you're going to put into the sales proposal stage. And because this is where you're going to be able to talk about where your MSP can assist to help address those limitations that you may have uncovered for them. And this is where we also do want to talk to the key stakeholders. Like I was mentioning, if we didn't get a chance in the initial discovery stage, talk to the initial stakeholders of the company, find out how and why they use the technology that they do, how it fits into their specific role and job function. So this is where conducting that workflow assessment with key individuals will be important, so that you can hopefully identify maybe any operational inefficiencies that could exist, again, that could be impeding the productivity, and then allow you to gain an understanding around how would their day be impacted if the technology that they relied upon failed, goes offline, and so they're not able to do the work or complete the work that they need to do. And so again, the overall goal here is we want to use this information to help us give kind of a return on investment, give them a cost of downtime to help justify your monthly fees, you know, when it comes time to kind of talk about that. So looking at how do you complete this part of the assessment process, there's a couple of parts. The first that we're going to do is that workflow assessment so that we can get an understanding of the critical end users, how they interact and utilize the technology in their day-to-day function, try and gain that appreciation around the impact that any sort of downtime has on their deliverables to the organization. Because when employees are rendered unproductive, the organization suffers. You know, no organization wants to have workers that are not working. And so that's going to help you put your recommendations together on what you need to do to keep the employees productive and working. And then in addition to the workflow assessment, we also do want to complete kind of that general technology assessment. We want to also get a review of their current and maybe future IT spending, maybe have a chance to look at their vendor contracts, because maybe if you have some partnerships with ISPs or printer companies, you know, maybe this is where this referral can come into play. You can kind of, you know, maybe bring some of those other partnerships in here. So if you can kind of get an understanding of who their vendors are, that could be helpful for you. And then use this to really determine if any improvements or maybe changes may need to be made. And then this is where you find out, do they have a realistic IT budget in place when it comes to their IT spending needs? So you may have to do a little bit of education here in terms of, you know, whether or not they're adequately budgeting enough for their IT. And spoiler alert, most companies do not. And just kind of a tip here, and I did talk about this in last week's boot camp. As you're conducting this part of the assessment, you know, anytime that you are talking to a prospect, be diligent as much as you can to capture your prospect's direct quotes when you're asking them about their business and what they're really looking to achieve. You know, as you're asking them about their goals and objectives and their priorities and their challenges. You know, anytime they tell you something important about what matters to them and to the business, I encourage you to write it down, get it recorded somewhere. Because this is going to be highly beneficial when you get to that proposal stage and the presentation stage of the sales process. Because if you're able to present them with your proposal and they're able to see their own direct quotes kind of sprinkled throughout it, they're going to know that you do understand and grasp their business objectives and their business requirements. They know that you're trying to sell them a contract, right? So they may not fully believe what you tell them, because they know that you're just trying to win the sale for the most part. You're trying to win that business from whoever they're using today. But they're not going to disagree with themselves in any sentiments that they've expressed to you. So you do want to do what you can to kind of capture, you know, any of their expressed needs in their own words, and then restate those words back to them exactly as they said them to you in that proposal document. So starting off with the end user workflow analysis, again, this is where we want to get an understanding around how do those critical end users interact, utilize the technology presently, or maybe not using technology as the case may be, as part of their day-to-day functions, so that you can gain an appreciation around what sort of impact would downtime have on their deliverables to the organization. And really speaking to the end users is useful because it will help highlight to, you know, the C-suite that you're dealing with, you know, when it comes time to sign the contract, that, you know, it's going to highlight if there's going to be any bottlenecks or any challenges from the team that might interfere with the organization being able to reach, you know, whatever the revenue or growth goals that are being communicated to you by the C-suite leadership team. Because if the C-suite believes one thing but then you go and start talking to the key workers or the key stakeholders and how they perform their job. That's going to help really identify what issues the team is currently experiencing that could impact the overall ability of the organization to achieve its goals. And so this part of the assessment, if you're thinking this is a little bit of an overkill, this is really what you use to provide that sanity check, to the C-suite team to help them determine if the organization as it stands today could realistically achieve its stated goals. And if you find that they can't, because you're talking to the people that are actually doing the work, then this is where, it gives you that opportunity to provide your input, make your recommendations, and make that part of the proposal. It could be a project or it could be an ongoing service issue. So looking at how do you conduct a workflow analysis, a general overview is it does start by interviewing the key stakeholders of the organization, because you do want to figure out, what are their tasks, what are their activities, what processes are they doing to help, their department help the business achieve its desired goals. And so the aim here is to uncover any inefficiencies, duplication, redundant tasks, pain points, barriers, bottlenecks in those processes so that you can identify opportunities for change. Opportunities for change equals money. It equals projects or services. It also helps to make any recommendations that you do make. It helps back those recommendations up. Because if you can help an organization become more efficient and become more productive, if you can help them lower their operational costs and improve their ability to generate more revenue more quickly, those are all phrases that the C-suite wants to hear. And so a good workflow analysis is going to help you really see if their workflows that are in place today are helpful or harmful in helping the prospects organizations really reach their desired revenue targets. So you're going to see a bunch of screenshots throughout this presentation. So hopefully you've noticed in the handout section, there's 3 different handouts there. One is this prospect assessment workbook. And so it's just an Excel spreadsheet that I kind of put together as I built out this boot camp. Nothing fancy, it's just Excel. But so anytime you see an Excel screenshot, it's coming from that handout. So if this is something that you think you might be finding useful, don't forget to download that Excel spreadsheet. So conducting our workflow assessment, to identify who the key stakeholders are that we do want to speak with, we want to get an understanding around, who are the most important, the most active employees that are currently working at your prospect's organization. And so we want to ask our prospect, and this could be something we could get ahead of time, right? Like we may not need to have a separate meeting for this. This might be information that you might be able to get over the phone or over an email, but really just kind of figuring out, how many active employees does the organization have? What's their title, their role, their position? What department are they part of? Are any of these employees technical or work as part of an internal IT department? You probably knew that already going in because, if you're dealing with a company that has IT versus a company that has no IT, you would know that from the very, very beginning because it's a very different sales conversation. It's a very different marketing conversation. But if you didn't, this is just kind of your reminder to find that out. And then see if they're willing to provide you with any sort of payroll information for each critical role, because this is what's going to be needed to help establish productivity and ROI, when it does come time to prepare and present the sales proposal, and then helpfully use that information to address any pricing objections that you may get from the prospect. See if you can find out, who the direct reports are that they may manage, getting their contact details. So if you feel it necessary, you might want to get a hold of them. And then finding out what's their daily work like. Do they work remotely? Do they work, in the office? Are they full-time, part-time? Kind of what does that situation look like for them? Because really we want to get an understanding of the org chart here and who reports into who. So you can have that visual as to how the organization is structured, so that you can really have that good understanding around who the key decision makers are, who the key stakeholders are that you need and want to speak with. Just in case you didn't get that before, because again, that first meeting, we should already have that, but if we didn't, this is our second opportunity to get that kind of knowledge. And then ask about if they're planning any new hiring initiatives. You know, are they, or they might be planning layoffs, you know, figuring out what they're doing from a staffing perspective, because that is also going to impact that workflow analysis. And we're going to need that information anyways when we get to the second part, when we get to the security and the compliance portion. And so thinking about, well, what kind of questions do I need to ask each stakeholder that we're speaking with? And this really came from a wonderful document that I found online from an HR firm. So this is in that spreadsheet as well. So really asking them, you know, questions around, you know, their current role, their current duties within the company. You know, ask them questions around, excuse me, who do they interact with? Who do they supervise? Who supervises them? You know, what's their working conditions like? You know, what's the equipment that they're using, the systems, the tools, the hardware, the software that they're using to perform their job? You know, asking them questions around, you know, what's their individual contributions to the overall strategic corporate goals. And then again, anytime they tell you something important, make sure that we're capturing those relevant quotes, you know, so that, again, we can add that into our sales proposal. You know, why is this important to them? And then, you know, depending on what kind of answers you get, you may want to create kind of a workflow diagram, some visuals, so that you can include when you are presenting your sales proposal. You know, especially if you've uncovered maybe some ineffective or inefficient workflows, and then you kind of have some suggestions of how you can make that better. Then we want to get some information around their technology spending, their IT budgeting process, and get an understanding of the kind of vendors that they're currently partnered with today. So some additional questions that you may want to ask in this section is just another screenshot from the workbook. Figuring out what their annual revenues, what their operating budget is for the company. Do they have an established budget for IT? What percentage of the IT budget, you know, what is that in comparison to the overall operating budget? You know, because here you really want to highlight if their operating budget, you know, I'm just kind of throwing out numbers here, is like 500,000, and their technology budget is only 10,000 of that, then that means that their IT budget represents just 2% of the entire operating budget. And, you know, we know that that's just too low, you know, given the tech environment, the security environment, the threat landscape environment that we're part of today. And so this is where, you know, you may need to start doing some level setting, and you may need to kind of reset expectations and help make them be a little bit more realistic for their budget, for their IT spending. But then some other spending details that hopefully you're able to collect, you know, from your key prospects. You know, if they're using another MSP today, you know, can they give you an idea around what are they currently spending with that other MSP on a monthly basis, annual basis? You know, depending on how that MSP has structured the contract, are they spending anything over and above on a reactive end user help desk type of basis on a monthly basis? You know, how much are they spending on security awareness training, technology education on a monthly basis? Can they tell you how much they've spent on technology capital expenditures, like if they purchase any new servers, workstations, laptops, network devices? You know, what does that whole refresh cycle look like for them? You know, can they tell you how much they're spending on warranties? How much they're spending on licensing, like business application and other software subscriptions, internet services, communications costs, and if possible, is it, you know, depending on the size of the company that you're dealing with, can you get this broken down by department so that you can, kind of get a little bit more granular if possible? They may not be able to give that to you. You might not be able to get any of this, but if you can, it's all going to be able to really help in your justification, help you build that ROI. And then lastly, this is where we want to complete that overview technology assessment. And so getting an understanding of, all of the software, the business applications that are currently being used in the business, what software licensing exists, do they have a recent software inventory report that they get from their existing MSP so that you can verify it for accuracy? If they say no, not a big deal, because when we get into the cyber assessment, you have to do this anyway. It's number one of the CIS controls. So, but it will give you an understanding of, is the current MSP that they're using, are they diligent in keeping an up-to-date software licensing list? Because that could be a win for you, taking over their licensing management if they're not doing that today. Getting understanding of the operating systems that are currently in use on the desktops and the servers. Is there an actual desktop standard for the applications? Is there any software that's banned, or that should be banned? So kind of start getting into, again, what is the existing MSP doing? What are they enforcing, or maybe what they're not enforcing? Is all software properly installed? Is it properly licensed? Is it accounted for? Taking into account, what on-premise or cloud software applications are currently in use. Who uses those different pieces of software? What's the reliance on that? Is there maintenance agreements or support contracts in place, or is it just pure subscription? Who supports these applications whenever there's an issue? Does the prospect, do they have to contact the vendor themselves when there's a problem with that particular software, that line of business software, or is the expectation that you as the MSP or their existing MSP is their job to liaison and work with the vendor to resolve these issues? And then getting them to find out, well, what do they prefer? Obviously, if you're the traditional managed services offering traditional managed services to the organization, vendor management is typically a key part of an advanced security or a fully managed program. So if their existing MSP today isn't doing anything like that, this could be another little tick point where you can say, we do this for our customers, because we understand, again, your job is to make money and run the business. You're having any sort of problems, we have partnerships, relationships, we know the vendor, we take care of that for our customers. So that could be another benefit and value point for you. And then for each piece of software that they do use, see if you can get a rating, 1 to 5 on how much they rely on that piece of software to do their job. And could they tell you how long they could tolerate the application being unavailable if something happened? If it goes offline for an hour, 4 hours, a day, what does that mean to you? How would that impact your role? I know with some of the applications that I use, like I have zero patience. If it goes offline for 5 minutes, I lose my mind. So it's kind of those types of sentiments you want to get, because that's information that if you can get the payroll information as well, that's going to allow you to calculate those downtime costs. For every hour or day, should that application be unavailable to that end user, what's that going to cost the organization in terms of their productivity? And then are there any business processes that maybe, and this may depend on, if you're a verticalized or a niche type of MSP, but, if you know the application, if asking the prospect, is there stuff about the applications they're using that it's not doing that you wish it did? Because this is, again, where you might be able to make recommendations about maybe there's another piece of software that's out there, or maybe the software does do it, but they just don't know. So maybe if you have that skill set, you can provide some training around that as a separate, professional type of services. Or trying to get understanding, is there any new software that they might be looking at that you can maybe consult and help them with? And then obviously getting an understanding around, what is the other software that's being used. That's more than likely what the MSP, their other MSP has installed. Like, what are they using from an endpoint protection basis? You know, AV, EDR, what are they using for password management? What are they doing for MFA? Is MFA turned on? Hopefully it's turned on. What are they doing from an email security standpoint, threat monitoring and detection? What are they doing from a web security standpoint, backup, all that kind of stuff. But again, if they don't know, because they may not know, you're going to find this out anyways because you need it for your cyber assessment, because number 2 is you need to know the software that's in the client's environment. And then conducting a review of their overall hardware and network infrastructure. So does a network diagram exist? How are the computers connected? You know, do they have remote, you know, work from home employees? Are they authorized? How's that set up? And again, they may not know, but this is stuff that you're going to want to really look at, because again, if there's deficiencies there, we want to capture that. That's a risk. We're expanding the attack surface. We need to put that into the proposal with our recommendations and make them aware of that. Okay. And then the second part of our assessment process should incorporate the cybersecurity and data risk assessment. And as I mentioned, this is where we're going to be leveraging the CIS controls. There's a checklist that in that workbook, there's a checklist that I've created based on the CIS controls to help you kind of compare and contrast what the current MSP is offering or might not be offering, so that you can have that better understanding of, you know, what is that MSP doing today for their customer, and where there might be security deficiencies that you creates urgency in your process that you need to come in and correct. I've sourced this also from beyond the CIS controls, some cyber liability insurance application forms, reviewed the questions that were asked in those application forms, and I've included those in the checklist as well, just to kind of make it as complete as possible. Because if cyber liability insurance companies are asking these types of questions of their applicants, then you want to make sure that your assessment process and the security services that you are subsequently going to promote and offer to your customers, that it covers those bases as well. And again, this is where you're able to highlight and differentiate your MSP from the incumbent, you know, especially if you find that there are some significant security deficiencies that you end up uncovering during the process that could be putting that prospect at serious risk of being breached, and then maybe not be able to get their data back or get their data back quickly. And so this is your opportunity to really help your prospect to see, acknowledge, and understand all of those risks, especially again, if their existing MSP isn't having that type of risk conversation with them, because, you know, your messaging, you know, that you should be putting out there in your marketing and in your sales, your messaging is, you know, your job as the MSP is to protect their revenues. That is your goal. You are a problem solver and you are the protector of their revenues. And to do that, you need to keep employees safe and the business as safe as possible. Because it's not just about providing IT support anymore, but it is all about finding the risks, making a recommendation so that you can mitigate those risks for the business. So we're going to be talking about the CIS controls to help us deliver this cyber and data risk assessment. And I've used them to create kind of a checklist of what should be completed during the assessment process. By incorporating the CIS controls into the assessment process, again, it's going to help us identify those potential security risks that the prospect may be exposed to, that their existing MSP maybe hasn't identified, or maybe the existing MSP doesn't even know about them because they haven't built their practice this way. And so that's, again, something that you can use to help demonstrate your security expertise, your authority, help differentiate yourself from whoever they happen to be using today, and more importantly, create that sense of urgency for yourselves within that sales process. And we'll talk about this more in part 3 when we get down to negotiations and you know, how do we get how do we get to the close? How do we stop the MSP or the sales process from stalling? It's this step. that's going to help prevent the deal from stalling and create that urgency, because your proposal is going to be able to outline, what steps do you need to take to remediate those risks that you've uncovered to help improve their security posture moving forward. So if you've already looked at the CIS controls, if you're familiar with that framework, it is very detailed. So really what my goal here is, I wanted to kind of outline at a broad level, what, each CIS control states, the most critical sections of each CIS control that would make sense, when we're talking about this assessment process. Because again, if you've looked at it, and anybody that's a little bit, familiar, this is 7.1. This is an older version of the CIS controls. Had 20 controls, 160 different subpoints in that. We all know that 8.1 is out now. They've just kind of condensed it from 20 down to 18. But for the purposes of this particular boot camp, it's still basically all the same. The sections are still the same. How I'm using it is still the same. So even though this is kind of based on 7.1, yes, 8.1 is out, but how we're using it, it doesn't materially impact what I'm talking about today. All right, so this is where we're going to go through each of the different CIS controls and relate it, how it can be incorporated into your cyber assessment process. And so you'll see the checklist items highlights on the right. This has been incorporated into a comprehensive document that's part of that, or a tab, actually, I think it's all in a tab of the prospect assessment workbook. So looking at CIS controls 1 and 2, these first two controls is all around, compiling an inventory of all the hardware and the software assets that are in the prospect's location. It makes sense, right? If you haven't already, got this information from the business assessment process in part 1, you're going to need to get it here in part 2. And these two pieces are absolutely critical, because you have to have an understanding of all the hardware and all the software that has to be monitored, managed, and secured within the prospect's environment, so that you can then readily identify those unauthorized or unmanaged devices or software applications that either need to be removed, or you need to figure out a way to make them managed and authorize them. So it is really about kind of getting that understanding, that awareness around, what's on the prospect's network and what shouldn't be on the prospect's network. Because when it comes to security and risk mitigation, you can't protect what you don't know about. And so being able to quickly identify what those unauthorized, what those unmanaged hardware assets are, those unauthorized software, that is what's going to help prevent unwanted security breaches and help increase the productivity of the end users. And so again, this is just kind of the screenshot as I go through each of the CIS controls, how I've kind of taken those highlights and built it into a checklist for you. So again, this is all part of the workbook. CIS control number 3 is all about securing configuration for those hardware devices and software. There's 5 sections part of the control, but at a high level, what control number 3 really talks about is maintaining documented security configuration standards for all the authorized operating systems and software. Organizations have to establish a baseline security configuration standard and implement a configuration management and change control process, and actively be able to report on the security configuration of all endpoint devices. We're looking at mobile devices here, laptops, servers, workstations. This is a control that is specifically mentioned as part of the cyber liability insurance application forms. It specifically asks if the applicant, rolls out a hardened baseline configuration standard across all the servers, the laptops, desktops, managed devices, because typically, as delivered by manufacturers and resellers, the default configurations for operating systems and applications is normally geared towards ease of deployment, ease of use, typically not security. And in the default state, these types of systems are very easily exploitable. But by developing configuration settings, with good security properties, that's not normally something that a small business owner is typically capable of doing on their own. So this is where they do need the oversight of an MSP, because they just dealing with who you're dealing with. You're dealing with non-technical business owners, right? And even if there was kind of a strong initial configuration that's been developed and has been installed, that has to be continually managed, because we want to avoid security decay. Because if this does not happen, again, attackers are going to find opportunities to exploit both the network and the accessible services and the client software. So organizations are directed to develop strong, secure baseline configurations for each deployed software system, and they're directed to maintain documented security configuration standards for all authorized operating systems software. And then this is something that, you as their, hopefully new MSP, you would be taking ownership of this and you would be managing this for them, again, helping to reduce their risk exposure. Number 4, vulnerability management. 7 sections to this particular control, but at a high level, control number 4 is all about developing a plan to continually assess and track vulnerabilities on all the assets within the infrastructure in order so that you can remediate and minimize the window of attack for the window of opportunity for attackers. It also includes the monitoring of public and private industry sources for new threat and vulnerability information, so you can kind of stay up to date on that. The focus of this control is to ensure that your prospect has that established vulnerability management program in place. Maybe their current MSP isn't doing that, and making sure that it's configured to conduct regular comprehensive credential scans across the organization. Another point that is specifically asked as part of a cyber liability insurance application form, because the goal is for you, if you're going to come in and be their new potential MSP, we have to identify all the risks, all the concerns that are present in the prospect's environment, so that you can then do a proper onboarding and put a proper remediation plan in place, and put that as part of your proposal document, so that you can outline how you're going to correct what you have uncovered, so that you can put them in a safer position immediately than where they are currently, and getting that in place post-sale. So again, we're trying to build in sense of urgency here when we're talking about and need to present our proposal to them. Because MSPs that don't conduct regular vulnerability scans as part of their services packages to try and uncover and address, discovered flaws in their customers' networks, that's what ends up putting their customers at higher levels of risk, because they face a significant likelihood of having their computer systems compromised. So we want to make sure that we're including this. Control number 5 is all about use of administrative privileges. There's 9 sections, but at a high level, number 5 is all about reducing the risk of attack by being cognizant about who needs and who has access to administrative privilege accounts, and tracking when and how those admin privilege accounts gets used. Because misuse of privilege is another big way of how attackers can get in and spread inside an organization's network. And again, it's another control that is specifically part of the cyber liability insurance application form. And it actually comes up a couple of times in that, because regular normal users of systems, they don't need admin privileges to do their daily tasks. Like, I don't need admin privileges to really do anything, right? Like, as a business owner, do they really need admin privileges? And this is, you want to be critical about this, because executives, they are the highest risk employees to the organization because of their inherent status. They're frequently a high value target sought by attackers. And so especially for those types of users, you want to control and you want to reduce their privileges and save it only for tasks that truly need that level of access. So really, we want to talk about this control just to kind of help our prospects, get them thinking critically about who gets access to what, and ensuring that only those that truly need access get granted the access. And so this control is actually one of the controls that can have the largest impact on reducing risk and preventing attacks within an organization. Control number 6 is all about maintenance, monitoring, analysis of audit logs. 8 sections as part of this particular control, but at a high level, this control is all about collecting, managing, analyzing audit logs of events that could help an organization detect, understand, and then recover from an attack should an attack happen. Deficiencies in security logging and analysis, this is what allows attackers to kind of hide their location. They can hide malicious software. They can move around on victims' machines and go about unnoticed. So even if the victims know that their systems have been compromised, if there's not protected and complete logging records available, then really you're blind to the details of the attack and to how subsequent attacks may have been taken by the attackers. And if we don't have, if the existing MSP doesn't have, solid audit logs in place, then an attack may go unnoticed indefinitely. And the particular damages that could occur, they could be irreversible, because logging records sometimes are the only evidence of a successful attack. And many organizations, they keep audit logs for compliance purposes, but attackers are relying on the fact that organizations really look at those audit logs and that they don't know that their system has actually been compromised. And so because of poor or non-existent log analysis processes, attackers can sometimes control victims' machines for months, years, without anyone in the organization actually knowing, even though the evidence of the attack, it's been recorded, but the files have just gone unexamined. And so as a result of this very high risk level, organizations are directed to ensure that local logging has been enabled on all systems, on all networking devices, and that those logs are reviewed on a regular basis. And so again, this becomes the responsibility of the MSP. A traditional business owner isn't going to know what to do around that. And this is where the MSP would utilize their SIM tool to be able to do that for them. And Enable has our MDR, our SOC, our SIM that could help with that if you're not doing that today. Number 7, email and web browser protections. This is a huge section on a cyber liability insurance application form. At a high level, number 7 is really all about minimizing the attack surface and the opportunities for attackers to manipulate human behavior, through the interaction with web browsers and emails systems. Attackers, they're targeting email, they're targeting web browsers with a bunch of different types of attacks. The most popular, most successful types of attacks being like social engineering attacks, phishing attacks, web browsers, email clients, very common points of entry of attack because of their direct interaction with users and with other systems and websites. And unfortunately, there's certain features of email clients, it can leave users particularly vulnerable. Because content can be crafted to entice or spoof users, spoofed emails pose a significant threat to organizations because they create that false sense of trust, right? End users end up taking actions that increases the risk of them allowing malicious code to be introduced into the environment. And that is what can end up resulting in a breach, right? Loss of valuable data, and also maybe possibly allowing other attacks to occur. And so organizations are directed to ensure that they're only using fully supported web browsers and email clients. And it's only by allowing fully supported, updated, approved email clients and web browsers where you can help organizations really mitigate that risk. Also, organizations are directed to use DNS filtering systems, so domain name system filtering systems, to assist in the identification and blocking of malicious domains. So finding out basically what is the existing MSP doing around this, if anything. Number 8, malware defenses. So 8 sections as part of this particular control, but at a high level, number 8 really talks about how do we safeguard to prevent or control the installation, spread, execution of malicious applications, code, and scripts on enterprise assets. Malware, especially ransomware, still a critical security issue. It's not going anywhere. Can be extremely destructive. You've probably seen it to an organization when they become a target of an attack. Malicious software is designed to help attackers gain access to and control over systems, control over networks, because the intent, they want to steal data. They want to capture user credentials. They want to encrypt or destroy data. And malware, it can come in the form of Trojan horses, viruses, worms, and that can also alter systems to help, an attacker gain access into a network. So to protect an organization from malware infections, control number 8 describes safeguards that should be implemented to help prevent these types of attacks. And so you want to make sure that you have these specific services included as part of an advanced security program, and then make sure it's part of your sales proposal if you discover that the existing MSP, maybe for some reason they don't have these types of safeguards in place, at the prospect's location, or maybe they're under protecting. Maybe they still have some sort of traditional AV in place, and we know that traditional AV, there's no room for it anymore in today's threat environment. Moving on to control number 9, limitation and control of network ports. 5 sections as part of this control, but at a high level, number 9 really describes the safeguards that are needed to manage the ongoing operational use of ports, protocols, services on network devices in order to kind of minimize the window of vulnerability that's available to attackers. Because attackers are always looking for, in an attempt to exploit accessible and vulnerable network services. So they're looking for poorly configured web servers, poorly configured mail servers, file and print services that are poorly configured. And many software packages, a lot of times, they automatically install services and turn them on as part of the installation of the main software package. And they're doing this without informing the user or the administrator that these services have actually been enabled. And so attackers, they're scanning for these services, and they're attempting to exploit these services, often attempting to exploit, the default user IDs and passwords, and wildly available exploitation codes. So because of this, basically any network port protocol running services, again, it increases the opportunity for a system to be compromised. And so as the MSP, you want to make sure that you're monitoring for open ports. You want to ensure that, only those ports, protocols, services that do have a valid business requirement are open or running on each system. Because again, the more open or the more accessible a system is, the greater the attack surface is. And with new exploits being discovered every day, anything that reduces the potential for the attack obviously is better, right? So monitoring for open ports, performing automated scans on a regular basis against, all systems, very critical to ensuring that unauthorized ports, unauthorized services are detected and addressed accordingly. And then moving into control number 10, data recovery capability. 5 sections as part of this control. It's another big section on a cyber liability insurance application form, but at a high level, here we're talking about safeguards that are needed to ensure that the processes and tools used to properly back up critical information, that they're in place, right, within the organization, and that there is a proven methodology for timely recovery of backup. Because it is the organizations where the MSP has implemented good, sound data backup strategies, they're the ones that are able to recover that lost data very quickly and very efficiently. So ensuring that, key system data is properly archived, that the backup integrity testing is completed regularly, having at least, one copy of their data backed up to an offline location, Those are all crucial in restoring systems and resuming services with the least amount of downtime if and when an organization falls victim to an attack. All right, so I know this is a very heavy course in terms of the content. You know, it's not the most exciting content. So I've built in just a 5-minute break so that everybody can stretch their legs, get a refill of their coffee or water. When we come back, we're going to continue the last half of the CIS controls, how you can use them to help build your cybersecurity assessment. And then the final part of today's boot camp is then how do you take all that information that you've been collecting and how do you interpret that data that you've been collecting and how do you use it to kind of build your case so that when we get to the sales proposal stage, you can then use the data that you're collecting here and that you did in the first meeting to develop your proposal and overcome objections. So I have it as like 9:41 Eastern time. We'll just take kind of a 5-minute break and then we'll kind of come back and we'll finish up. Okay. All right. Hopefully everyone had an opportunity to stand up, stretch your legs, walk around for a little bit. So let's get into kind of the second half of the boot camp. So continuing on with reviewing, you know, the different CIS controls and their importance to the cybersecurity assessment process, but also making sure that, you know, your services that you offer, you know, your advanced security program, whatever you happen to call it, making sure that, you know, your service offerings, your package services incorporates a lot of these things as well. So it's a good checkpoint for what are you delivering today as well, and do maybe any changes need to be done there. But looking at control number 11, secure configurations for network devices. Here we're looking at things like firewalls, routers, switches, 7 sections to this control, but basically number 11 is all talking about safeguards that are needed to establish, implement, actively manage, you know, the security configuration of network infrastructure devices. And this is typically done using, you know, some sort of, you know, configuration management, change control process again, to prevent attackers from exploiting maybe any vulnerable services and settings that may exist. Because again, we want to make sure that we're hardening those critical network infrastructure devices against compromise. And we want to make sure that we are establishing and maintaining visibility into any changes that occur, you know, whether those changes are made by legitimate administrators or by somebody else. So this is very similar to when we talked about secure configurations for hardware and software back in control number 3, because as delivered from manufacturers and resellers, default configurations for network devices, firewalls, routers, switches, again, they're geared towards more ease of use, ease of deployment, not necessarily taking security into account. And so attackers, they're searching for these vulnerable default settings. They're looking for these gaps, these inconsistencies in firewall rules, routers and switches, and they're working to do what they can to exploit those flaws and then use those holes to gain access into an organization's network so they can then get access to the data, alter that data, redirect traffic on a network, or even use a compromised machine to pose as another trusted system somewhere else on the network. Control number 12 is about boundary defenses. Really what we're talking about here is putting the safeguards that are needed to ensure that the entry points into the network are clearly defined and that they're monitored. So we're looking at things like, again, firewalls and proxies, DMZ, IDS, IPS, NetFlow, remote access, those types of things. Because boundary defense is typically that organization's first line of protection against outside threats. You know, attackers are focused on trying to exploit systems that they can reach across the internet. So they're constantly probing perimeters for vulnerabilities and information that's required to help them succeed. So an organization's boundary defense strategy, it shouldn't be just about keeping the attackers out, but also keeping the sensitive information in, right? So an MSP should be working to identify, you know, all those systems that access the organization's network from all the different locations that are out there, and they should have an understanding of the boundaries of the network, and then determine from there how access should be controlled and what protocols are allowed, so that any communication over unauthorized TCP or UDP ports or any sorts of application traffic, making sure that that's then denied. Because network boundaries, they don't have a clear edge anymore today, right? They're no longer defined as that kind of single ingress point that's protected by a firewall and edge routers like have been done in the past. Today network perimeter extends beyond the gateway, encompasses like the cloud, especially when we're talking about AWS or Azure or other services, VPN endpoints, especially now that we have more and more users that are working from home or having that flexibility in their work environment, their work location. And so by verifying what the existing MSP is doing to strengthen an organization's perimeter and what are they doing to police traffic that's flowing in and out of the network, that is, again, going to help let you know what additional measures may be needed, again, making it part of your proposal. Maybe it might be a project to mitigate that risk that might be associated with each of those edges. 13 is all about data protection. So control number 13 really talks about safeguards that are needed to ensure that all data is classified and protected in accordance with established data classifications. So it's basically here again focusing on secure data management and implementing the proper controls that are needed to prevent data from leaving your prospect's environment in some sort of unstructured or unauthorized way. And we know data resides in a whole lot of different places, right? So an important component of this control is helping your prospects understand what kind of data they have, because you as their MSP then need to classify it, then build a plan around what needs to be done to secure and protect it. Because just like with devices, if you don't know what kind of data they have, and if you don't understand how critical it is to the organization, then how are you ever going to be able to secure and protect it? And so here we're looking to see if there is some type of data protection plan or data inventory document, data classification policy that might be in place that's been implemented by the other MSP, so that it clearly identifies, what kind of data is being stored, where is that data being stored, and if their existing MSP hasn't done this for them, then again, this is where you kind of highlight, how you're different, how you protect your customers, how you look at security different than maybe who they're using today, because you can explain how critically important this is from a business risk mitigation standpoint, and that this is part of just your regular part of services. So again, these little points is what really constitutes why your services are likely going to be higher than maybe who they're using today, because if their existing MSP isn't doing anything like this and you are, this is important. If a company doesn't have their data, like the stat is like 60% of the time they will not survive a data breach. So this is really important from an assessment standpoint, and then from a services offering standpoint as well. And you can use that again to demonstrate your expertise, to continue differentiating your MSP from whoever they're using today, because data protection is important. A lot of cases, either the law that your prospect protects certain kind of data, or they have some sort of regulatory obligation to make sure that there is processes in place to protect that critical data. Number 14, controlled access behind kind of the need to know. This basically describes the safeguards that are needed to ensure that users are only allowed access to information that they're authorized for or that they need to use as part of their job duties. And so it really does focus on ensuring that prospects' networks are segmented based on the criticality of the data and the organization that the organization is collecting, and then restricting access to that data based on the actual business needs. So this is very much is a follow-up to control number 13. Once you understand what kind of data the client has, and then understanding what the users are in that organization, this will allow you to then determine, and again, it might be another project, to do what you need to do to kind of segment and make sure that data is only being accessed by people that should be accessing that data. Because again, we want to reduce the ability for an attacker to communicate to other devices on the same subnet from a compromised system. And so you want to make it as difficult as possible for attackers to get access, to every system within the environment. And so as part of this control, you also want to make sure that access control lists, that they're created, maintained, that they're audited regularly, because just because a list might have been established 6-9 months ago doesn't necessarily mean that the prospect's organization has remained static during that same period. Users come and go, roles change within the company all the time. And so this kind of goes to how important, and I talk about this quite a bit, how important regular reviews are with the senior executive team. QBRs, they not need to be done quarterly, but they should at least be done at least twice a year, every 6 months, so that you understand, if there have been any personnel changes that have been made within the company, so that you can update those employee lists, those access control lists, and those Active Directory settings. Looking at number 15, wireless access control. This basically describes the safeguards that are needed to ensure that wireless access is configured properly, so that you're tracking and you're controlling that access and you're preventing unauthorized access. And if any misconfigurations are found, the settings have to be corrected. And so here again, we're looking specifically at the security of wireless local area networks, access points, wireless client systems, because who doesn't have a wireless system in their organization these days, right? It's just a natural part of the majority of network infrastructure these days. It's just so commonplace, and many workforces rely on the wireless access because it's just so convenient and it's just so flexible. Being able to kind of, whenever I do go to an Enable office, just being able to pick up my laptop and kind of walk to a boardroom if I need to be in a boardroom, and I don't need to bring all my cables with me and stuff, or have to plug into Ethernet. It's just, we all know how convenient and flexible it is. And while wireless is beneficial, it exposes the attack surface, right? It just expands it. It exposes the network to an array of other problems that are related to network boundaries. And so here we do want to verify how well is the existing MSP doing at really protecting and managing the prospect's Wi-Fi and access systems. And the protection of this critical component really should be made part of any mature security plan. So if you don't have it as part of your services today, maybe think about adding it, because it is necessary to know who is connected to the network, where are they connecting from, and then as their MSP, you're in a good position to be able to help them monitor and assist with that. Number 16, account monitoring and control. This really describes the safeguards that are needed to ensure that all accounts are maintained in a fashion that does promote clean account hygiene, because it is through misuse or neglected account maintenance that can lead to a potential system compromise. Again, another strong connection to an earlier control, number 5, which speaks to elevated privileges. But what we're doing here with number 16 is it looks at all the accounts and how local computer and application policy specifically can be configured to support good account hygiene. So here we're looking at things like, does the prospect's MSP, deactivate the accounts, pretty much everywhere for past employees, in the event that maybe they've resigned or been terminated or moved on for some other reason. And this is really just about controlling, what accounts live and die and when, right? Again, basic account lifecycle management, having that good understanding of what kind of accounts are in use, what accounts are legitimately still active, and which ones are no longer valid or in use. So again, going back to, this is why you have to have those ongoing QBRs, EBRs, whatever you want to call them, with your customers, so that you can keep up to date and get a handle on this account lifecycle management to make sure that nobody is missed. Because, contractors, employees that have been terminated, but maybe they haven't been deleted in the system. If you don't know about it, then these pose high risk, right? Attackers, they're looking to find and exploit legitimate but inactive user accounts so that they can maybe impersonate them or gain access into the system. Especially if there's no maybe an offboarding policy in place when someone leaves. You know, this is where malicious insiders or former employees, they can still gain access to the accounts that have been left behind in the system long time after they've maybe already left the company, right? And keeping access to the organization's computer system and possibly getting access to that data if they want to use it for, you know, malicious purposes. And this also looks at whether the, you know, whoever they're using today, the incumbent MSP, you know, do they also enforce the use of MFA, you know, two-factor on the accounts, because that is another simple but effective control that should be implemented to protect prospects organizations from you know, getting that unauthorized network attempts and doing what you can to make network attempts by authorized users as difficult as possible. Number 17, implementing security awareness training. You know, there's 9 sections, but basically what this control really talks about is the importance of implementing a security awareness program, you know, within every organization you support. Obviously, what that looks like will depend on the size and the maturity of the organization, but we don't want to fall complacent and think that cyber defense is primarily a technical challenge. But, you know, a lot of times it's the actions of people. They also play a critical part in the success or failure of an enterprise preventing or falling victim to an attack. Stats always seem to be varied. I think in the latest report, I think they said it's now 72% of breaches is the result of an employee clicking on something that they shouldn't have clicked on. I've seen it as high as 87%, depending on what reports you read. But it's an important piece that has to be addressed in our cyber assessment. We need to find out if it's happening today, and we need to make sure that we're including it in our security services that we offer moving forward. And because if you're not doing it, it's a real oversight. And again, it helps because if you include it in your programs, yes, it's going to make your programs more expensive, but that's not a bad thing. Like, you're building in these extra security services, these extra features, all in the name of doing what you can to mitigate risk and make their employees and their data as secure as possible. And so really the key message behind this type of control is implementing a security awareness program to really teach employees about the best practices, the current defense strategies that are best, and then what is expected from them, because they play a role in that as well, and they have to understand what that role is. You know, and if you've listened to any of my other boot camps, there's one that I deliver on finding opportunities in a saturated market. That boot camp specifically, it's a marketing one, specifically focuses on ways that MSPs can differentiate themselves, you know, where they're not relying on calling themselves MSPs. Like, I look at so many websites and they have managed services plastered across their websites, but who cares? Like, that name, that's an industry term. You know, regular non-technical business owners, they don't think of it in that way. But if you know, if you're trying to set yourself apart from your competition, you know, you absolutely, if you already are very security centric and you're already offering security awareness training, you know, there's nothing wrong with, you know, promoting yourself as, you know, that being that security trainer, or, you know, that security specialist, and using that as your foothold to get in, you know, to have that first meeting, using that as your hook. And then your managed services, your security services, just, you know, rides the coattails of that. And then number 18, application software security. What we're talking about here is the importance of managing the security lifecycle of all in-house developed and acquired software, and I'm more focusing on the acquired software here, to prevent, detect, and correct any security weaknesses. Vulnerabilities can be present any number of reasons, right? You know, there could be coding mistakes, logic errors, incomplete requirements, failure to test for unusual or unexpected conditions. The bad actors can take advantage of these types of vulnerabilities. You know, that can be found in software applications, web-based applications, and they can attempt to weaponize them into exploits. And so really what we're doing with this control, we're looking at things like, you know, does the prospect's MSP, are they monitoring to ensure that all versions of third-party software being used within the environment, is it still supported by the vendor? And again, another question, this is specifically asked on cyber liability insurance application forms. Like, it asks if there's any end of life or end of support software residing on the network, because if there is, that introduces a potential vulnerability and a breach risk to the organization. We also want to make sure, you know, does the prospect's MSP have a regular patch cycle? Are they regularly monitoring for patches and updating third-party software? And so scans should be completed on a regular basis to assess and then try to uncover any type of application vulnerability so that we can patch and correct them. Number 19 is making sure you have a good incident response and management process in place. So it talks about the importance of establishing and maintaining an incident response capability. So making sure we have the policies, the plans, the procedures, you know, who's supposed to be doing what, that we have regular training, we have the communications in play when an attack is meant to happen, so that you can prepare, detect, and then respond quickly to an attack. And so this allows you to kind of have that conversation with the prospect and say, does your current MSP have an incident management plan in place? Have they shared that plan with you? You know, if they detect something and they call the MSP, what happens after that? Because the customer needs to know about this. The business has to need to know about this. Because if your prospect does suffer a data breach or a phishing or a ransomware attack or a delay of service attack, you know, do they know how their existing MSP is going to respond? You know, what happens next? Because again, a mature, security conscious MSP that offers and support a quality security program, they're going to have that in place. So again, another differentiator for you. They're going to have, and they'll be able to show you a document incident response program that they have in place for their MSP and for their customers. Because again, your MSP, your goal is to protect your customers' information, protect their reputation. And this is accomplished by developing and implementing an incident response infrastructure that's going to allow you to quickly uncover the attack, you know, once you find out, help you contain that attack, and doing what you can to neutralize and eradicate that attacker's presence, and then being able to help your client, you know, with the restoration, right? You know, restore the integrity of the network, get their systems back online as quickly as possible. Because again, it's not about if, it's about when. And when an incident occurs, if there is no documented response plan in place, it's going to be too late for their MSP to try and develop one in the moment, on the fly. It's not something that can just be winged. Because without an incident response plan in place, the MSP may not even discover the attack in the first place. Or if the attack is detected, the MSP and the customer may not follow the proper procedures for afterwards and the best practices that are needed to contain the damage, and again, neutralize the attack, eradicate the presence, and then recover in that secure fashion. And as a result, the attack may have, you know, success and a far greater impact, and end up causing more damage, infecting more systems, potentially infiltrating, being able to pull out more sensitive data than otherwise would have been possible if there wasn't a properly well-defined effective incident response plan in place. And so this is something you do want to ask in the assessment process, because again, it's another true differentiator for those MSPs that truly take risk mitigation and cyber resiliency seriously for their customers versus those that are a little bit more laxed, or maybe haven't thought about that, where maybe it's just words that they put in their marketing to sound like they do. And if anybody has listened to Lewis Pope, our head security nerd, he is now doing boot camps on tabletops. So not maybe something that, you know, my audience might be interested in, but your text that, you know, would be part of your incident response plan and process. You know, Lewis, and I think he's doing another one in Empower in Berlin, tabletop exercises where, you know, all of a sudden an attack happens, the customer calls in, what do you do? And so running through a tabletop exercise is a fantastic exercise to really determine what would those next steps be and what steps are maybe getting missed, so that you can help really kind of fine tune and refine your incident response plan. And then the last one, number 20, is all about, you know, recommending that organizations really test their security controls that are in place to really determine what the overall strength of the organization's defense is, you know, taking into account the technology, the processes, and the people, by simulating the attacks the actions of an attacker. And so one approach to be able to do this is by conducting pen testing exercises, which is the intentional launch of cyber attacks in order to evaluate an organization's overall security. There's 8 components that are part of this particular control, but really there's just one key item that we want to pull from that to add to our assessment checklist, and that's really, you know, does the prospect's MSP perform any sort of pen testing on their network as part of their overall risk mitigation strategy, as part of their overall risk assessment strategy? Are they doing it on a regular basis? You know, does the prospect's MSP use, you know, pen testers, ethical hackers to conduct tests in order to try and break into their network to highlight the blind spots on their websites, their applications, or any other areas onto their network? Because again, it is by identifying these vulnerabilities where MSPs can then help businesses stay on top of their security management and build up that security awareness. This is different from vulnerability testing, which we talked about earlier in control number 4. Vulnerability testing and uses non-intrusive scanning to identify weak points in a system's security in an attempt to uncover security breaches, but it's not designed to exploit them. Pen testing, in comparison, does use intrusive methods to kind of test how damaging a cyber attack could be for an organization. And so what it does is it works to really imitate a real attack to discover exactly what IT assets an attacker could access, could gain access to. Using vulnerability and pen testing together, that is what can really produce a good comprehensive overview of all security deficiencies and really help bring this information to the forefront of the security and risk conversation, right? When you are working with prospects, especially if they're existing MSP, again, if they're not really doing anything from this level of security perspective. Admittedly, this can be an expensive exercise to undertake. External and internal pen tests, though, if you can build it in, they are valuable in revealing vital weaknesses in your prospects' IT systems. They can highlight how vulnerable the data and other assets are to breaches or to being compromised. And then this is another data point that you can then use to bring that sense of urgency into your sales process and allow you to really create that compelling sales proposal. And again, you're just highlighting your thoroughness, your expertise, your knowledge, you know, and how you just run an entirely different MSP, you know, when it comes to cyber protection and resiliency. Okay, so I know a very long section, but I did feel it was important to kind of go through the CIS controls because it is something that, you know, MSPs, we should be basing, you know, how we're running our organization, how we should be coaching and educating our business, our customers, how they should be organizing their business network and their data. So I just kind of wanted to bring it into this particular boot camp. But now what I want to do is, you've been collecting all this data, right? So there's a lot of probably raw data that you've been collecting, from the network, from the key stakeholders that you've been speaking with. So in this final section of the bootcamp, what I want to do is focus on the actual methodology. And this is where I was kind of talking about, if this is a manual process here, there's tools that are out there. I will leave it up to you to determine what tools you may want to use once you understand the methodology, but I thought it was important to kind of go through the theory behind it. But we'll talk about the actual methodology on what to do with this data and how to analyze it. And so how can you then include the results and the recommendations in your assessment report that you can then use to help build your compelling sales proposal for prospects. So we're going to be talking about 5 steps in our methodology process. And when we talk about step number 1, it is that data audit that we talked about earlier with CIS control number 10 with the data recovery capability, and CIS control number 13 with the data protection. Because we do need to gain that understanding as to the type of data that your prospect collects, so that we can help determine the value of that data to the organization, because they may not truly understand it, but we need to find this out so we can educate them on how valuable that data is. So one of the things that you need to figure out before starting your audit is, what is your standard going to be? And meaning that, how are you going to rate or classify the importance of a particular asset? Because again, we've just itemized all those assets, control number 1, control number 2, but we also need it as part of our tech assessment that we did in part 1. An easy way, I think, to classify an asset is to really base it upon the importance of that asset to the overall business. And you would do this, again, by asking your prospect a couple of key questions. So again, more screenshots, all part of that comprehensive spreadsheet. But asking questions around, what kind of data does the organization collect? Are they collecting financial data like banking information, account numbers from their customers? Are they collecting customer information like, personal information, email address, phone numbers, date of birth, that type of thing? Are they collecting intellectual property? So like coding information? Is there special projects or services? Is there patents? Is there copyrights, trade secrets, or other types of confidential business information? And then getting understanding of what asset is that data found on, who has access to this data, both internally and externally, and then how valuable is this information to a competitor if their competitors should get their hands on it. And here we're kind of looking at giving it a rating of high, medium, or low. And then asking them, like, could you recreate this information from scratch if you had to? And if the answer is yes, all right, well then how long would it take you to recreate this lost data, this stolen data? And then how much, what are the associated costs that you think would be attached to this for you to do that? And then if you lost this data completely, what would the impact be on your day-to-day operations for you and your team? And, how, could your staff continue to work without it? And so this is where we want to get an impact rating of high, medium, or low. And then what impact would losing this information have on your revenue or profitability? And again, we want to ask for that impact rating of high, medium, or low. And then based on, how the prospect kind of answers these questions, you can then use these answers to start classifying each asset included in the assessment, as being either a critical asset or a major asset, or maybe it's just a minor asset. And what I'm meaning here is, if important financial data is found on the CFO's computer and the data loss and the revenue loss impact would be high, then the asset classification rating for that CFO's desktop, we would state it as critical. That's kind of how that works together. And then in this spreadsheet, if you'd like, you may want to color code it, red for critical, orange for major, yellow for minor. I haven't, but, if you want to make it a little bit more visual to your prospect. And yes, we are kind of interviewing the user here. We will obviously want to get their opinion and so they can advise you on assets they believe are valuable to to their role and to the organization. But they may not fully understand the importance and the role that each asset plays in the organization. So you kind of want to be mindful of this as well, that they say that, yeah, this is just a kind of a minor asset. But if you're understanding that they use that minor asset and they're telling you that there's confidential sensitive data on it, then you need to kind of escalate the classification, and maybe it becomes a major asset or a critical asset. Then step 2 is we need to start identifying all of the security risks and the potential threats that could impact the prospect. And so again, we're building on that asset information that we just collected in our data audit. So we now need to look at the rest of the prospect's infrastructure, all of those other assets that are connected into the network, whether that be physically, virtually, remotely, if it's within cloud environments. And we also want to look at all the software applications, all the operating systems, and any other line of business applications that may be in place. And again, we probably would have already collected this from our tech assessment. So we're just kind of carrying that information through, but making sure that we do have an up-to-date software list, asset inventory list, maybe a network diagram if that's something that would be helpful here, because what we're trying to do is really use these pieces to help determine what the prospects crown jewels are, those assets that are the most critical to the business and therefore would be the primary target for attackers. So I've actually created in the workbook 2 versions of this chart for the 2 different types of assets that you're going to be assessing. So software applications that the key stakeholders rely upon, and the hardware assets that the organization relies upon. And then for each asset, again, trying to fill out, what's the purpose of the asset? Why is it important? How critical is the asset to the functioning of the organization? Giving it a reading of high, medium, and low. How is that asset used on a day-to-day basis? Are there any existing security policies or controls that are in place to help protect that asset from getting attacked, getting breached? How does it fit into the overall prospects network? And then are there any technical security controls or physical security controls that are in place currently? Then what we have to do after that is then identify all the potential threats the prospect could fall victim to, whether that would be cyber or it could be other threats, because I know we're kind of focusing on cyber, but there's a lot of other threats that could impact the safety and security of the employees and the data that the organization is collecting and using. It could be, when we talk about threats, it could be any vulnerability, any tactic, technique, any method used by threat actors that could be exploited to breach security, where their goal is to, cause harm or steal data from that organization. But again, it's just not hackers we have to be worried about. We got to think about natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, lightning, fire. They can destroy as much or even more as a cyber attack, because not only could you lose data, but you could lose servers too, right? Depending on what happens. Any sort of network or system failure, is the prospect's most critical systems running on high quality equipment, or is it low quality equipment? Does the equipment meet your standards? And again, this is going to come from the data that you gathered as part of that asset discovery in CIS control number 1 or control number 2. Human error. I said, I think the last report I read was 72%, but I've seen as high as 87%, 88%. But a large chunk of breaches were the result of some type of human error. And so does the prospect's existing MSP. Are they doing proper education? Are they doing proper training around malware, phishing, social engineering? Are they educating around the importance of regular backups, strong password management? I still come across MSPs where, data protection is an add-on. It's a bolt-on. It's not a main critical element of a packaged program of services, because they want to try and keep the price down. I think we can all agree that backup is really important. So we want to make sure, what is the existing MSP doing? What's their kind of stance when it comes to backup? How do they handle password management? Is there a sense of strong password management being enforced by the existing MSP? Also, we need to look at unauthorized access from attackers, malware, employee error, misuse of information by those unauthorized users. Where there could be an insider threat that could happen where data is being altered, it could be deleted, it could be accessed and used without approval. There could be data leaks that we need to be worried about where, personally identifiable information, so that PII data, other sensitive data could be, stolen because of poor configuration, as an example of cloud services. Loss of data, where the organization, maybe it's accidental, loses or deletes that data. Service disruption, where there could be loss of revenue or reputational damage as a result of unexpected downtime, and then obviously software coding vulnerabilities. And then the last task, what we need to do is we want to outline, for the prospect, what could go wrong then, right? Once you've identified the threats that are facing your organization, the prospect's organization, we have to then assess the impact or the potential impact. And so this involves, specifying what could be the consequences of an identified threat exploiting a vulnerability of an in-scope critical asset. And so just kind of keep adding on to the spreadsheet here, the screenshot. But as an example of how what we mean by this is, say there's a potential threat. And maybe the threat is, an attacker performs an SQL injection on an unpatched web server. So the vulnerability is it's an unpatched, that's the vulnerability, and the asset is the web server. And the consequence could be to steal customers' private data. Like that's the end goal. And so what we want to do is summarize information like this, because again, we want to make it easy for all stakeholders to understand the risks that they face in relation to their key business objectives. And we want to communicate what these risks are, along with our recommendations and best practices to address those risks in our proposal stage. Step 3 then is our risk analysis step. And this is where we want to identify those risks to determine their overall impact on the prospect's organization, because this is where we want to start moving away from what could happen and start moving towards, what has a chance of actually happening. And so this is where we want to determine, the likelihood of the risk scenarios, of the potential threats that we just documented in the previous threat. What are the chances of them actually occurring? And then if they did, what would be the impact on the organization? And so in a cybersecurity risk assessment, we talk about this as the risk likelihood. Risk likelihood is the probability that a given threat is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability. And we typically rank this on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1, the risk likelihood is rare, 5, the risk likelihood is highly likely. And then we do the same for the breach impact. We want to rank the impact of the breach, potential breach, on a scale of 1 to 5. And when we think about the breach impact and we're trying to define it, really what we're doing here is we want to refer to kind of the magnitude of harm to the organization resulting from the consequences of whatever threat exploiting whatever vulnerability we've uncovered. And so again, we would use a rating of 1, where there would be minimal impact, or it would be a negligible breach impact if a breach occurred, to 5 being very severe, basically saying that a breach, it could be a potential extinction event for that organization. And so what we want to do here is we're trying to quantify the various risks, the various threats that have been identified, and come up with essentially a scoring system as to how susceptible the prospect's hardware and software assets are to certain types of attacks. And so a couple of more columns to the spreadsheet so that you can kind of rate the risk likelihood, the breach impact for each of those vulnerable assets that we've identified, and making sure we're rating it on that scale of 1 to 5. And then step 4 is all about evaluating the risk levels. And we're just doing this via a risk matrix. It's basically taking all the information that we've collected up to this point for each asset, along with the ratings that we've assigned to each asset in terms of risk likelihood, breach impact, and then grading that risk that's inherent to each asset on a scale of low to very high. So just another screenshot of a sample risk matrix here that you can refer to. This is part of the assessment workbook as well, where we talk about the risk level being the breach impact multiplied by the risk likelihood. And again, we're just trying, without the use of tools or software, we're trying to use this risk matrix to make it easier for the prospect to understand the severity of the risk that their organization is currently exposed to, because this will then allow you then to put your recommendations in place, make your proposals, to talk about what you need to do to mitigate these risks that you've identified, or at least address them, to make them aware of that. Because, ultimately at the end of the day, if they don't want to pay for it, that's your decision of, well, maybe I don't take them on as a client because the risk is too high and they won't acknowledge it. Or maybe you do take them on, and then you constantly remind them that these things need to be addressed. And so the idea is that you would run through each of the different risk scenarios that you've gone through, so that you can assign that risk level to each risk scenario. So kind of going back to our SQL injection attack, which would be considered, I think, a severe or a very severe attack in terms of its breach impact. And we're also thinking it might be likely or a highly likely to occur type of attack, which means then that the risk rating level for that SQL Server asset, we would classify it as being high or very high. So just kind of how that works. And so again, just provides that visual scoring system to help you quantify risk, because quantifying risk is it's a difficult thing to do. And so if you're not using tools, if you're going to kind of start off with a manual process to start, just to kind of get this going, at least this gives you, again, that visual when you're trying to explain your recommendations and why you're recommending what you're recommending. And so you can see that I've kind of added some additional columns to the spreadsheet. So a very high or a high risk rating would mean that corrective actions would need to be developed, deployed as soon as possible, meaning, if they decide to sign on as a managed services client, you would want to start completing that upfront project first, because you'd want to get that issue resolved before the monthly program started. So again, we're building an urgency into our sales process with this. A medium to high risk rating means that corrective actions, need to be developed, they need to be deployed, but within a reasonable amount of time. And this could just be either an upfront project, or maybe this just naturally gets resolved through the course of your monthly security services. Or a low risk rating means that, maybe they accept it, maybe you figure out a way to reduce it, but the breach impact, the risk likelihood is not as high, so it's given a low risk rating. And then you can see I've added in an additional column for that. And then these recommendations get included as part of your assessment report and your sales proposal. And then the final step is to really document all of the risks that you've identified to create a risk assessment report that you would include in your broader assessment report, and then to create a remediation plan that you would then begin implementing once the prospect decides to sign on with you. And then should you win the client, this risk assessment report becomes part of the technology roadmap, and that is your living, breathing document that you're going to be able to refer to on a regular basis as part of your onboarding activities, and then as part of your regularly quarterly, semi-annually executive business reviews with your client. This is a report that you can then continually refer to, so that it keeps you and your customer aware of if there are still any outstanding cybersecurity risks that they're exposed to. This still needs to be addressed, and we still need to figure out a way to get them addressed, whether it's an investment in another project or software or what have be. And this way, by having this in place, should something happen, by having this documented and by you continually discussing this and open and honest conversations with your client, this is what's used to help limit your liability and take emotion out of a potential breach, because the client here is the only one to blame. Like if you decide to accept them as a client, and that's a whole other boot camp and a whole other conversation. But if you decide to accept this client on, this is your way that if they get breached and they have to make a claim with their insurance company, you can say, look, we did our due diligence. You know, we made the client aware. They opted not to make the investment. So the breach is not our fault. The customer is the negligent party. And that's really what the insurance company is trying to find. They want to find that negligent party. And so this is really what I'm showing here is a sample of what we call a risk register. And I just had a conversation with an MSP about this yesterday, and they're not really doing anything from a risk register standpoint. But it is really important that, you know, every MSP have something like this in place with each of their customers, and that they are continually reviewing this at every review meeting. And when you're looking at creating your own risk report, basically what we're doing here is we're identifying every threat. So we're talking about kind of the risk scenario. So we're outlining the vulnerability that was uncovered, along with the likelihood of the occurrence, when we found that vulnerability, what we feel is the current risk level, you know, very high, medium, and low that we just determined via the risk matrix. Are there any existing security controls in place? If there's not, what's going to be our treatment plan? So what are the activities and the timeline that we propose we want to do to bring that risk into an acceptable risk tolerance level? So these are basically what are your security control recommendations? And then if this is something that you then include as part of your regular conversations in your QBRs, this is where you give your progress status. So what's the status of implementing the treatment plan that you proposed back in your assessment process? And this is something that will get continually updated and reviewed. Is there any residual risk, you know, after the treatment plan has been implemented? And then who is the risk owner? So this could be you, this could be the organization. For the most part, it's up to the organization to mitigate their own risk. If there is risk in that organization, that's not on you, that's on them. It's all part of NIST and the govern function, right? But so most time the risk owner, you're going to put the organization there. All right, so hopefully that made sense. So what I also wanted to try and do is, once you've collected that data, what would the report format look like so that you can then review it with your prospect? So as part of the handout sections, I've also created a sample report that you can use and customize to help deliver your assessment findings and recommendations to your prospect. It's a very business-oriented report if you've had a chance to kind of take a look at it yet. And what I've done is it's a report that focuses on what's important to the business owner and the C-suite and what they value. Because at the end of the day, we need to talk in the love language of business owners, non-technical business owners. I've seen a lot of reports, you know, with hardware inventories included in them, software inventories included in them, very high level technical information in them, percentages, graphs. That's not what your business owner prospect cares about. Yes, you do need to collect all that information so that you can do your assessment. But your business owner prospect, they only really care about the findings, and they only really care about your recommendations. And that's what this report really focuses on. You know, your business owner customer only really cares about what issues did you find that maybe my current MSP missed or isn't doing today. How critical are those issues? Like, how is it going to impact my business and my employees? What needs to be done to fix it? And if I didn't do it, what would the impact be if it remained unactioned? And so when it's laid out in this format, again, this is what works to create that sense of urgency within your sales process. This is what helps stops the sales process from stalling or from you getting ghosted, and hopefully will motivate the prospect to sign with you. So again, this template's there. Hopefully, if you find it useful, you can download it. So after going all this, I'm probably thinking a lot of you are wondering, oh my goodness, Stephanie, this is too much, right? Do I really need to bother going into this level of detail and all this trouble just for a prospect? Yeah, I feel it's necessary, because like I said in the beginning, if you haven't done anything like this before and you are kind of lacking a structured assessment process in the beginning, yes, this is probably seeming like way too much. But I do believe that as you keep going with it, as you tweak it, as you make it your own, you're going to get comfortable with the process and it won't take as long. Like number one, yes, but by the time you get to 10, 15, 20, it's not going to take as long, especially if it's at that point that you now understand what certain data collection tool sets do I need to invest in to bring into the mix. And even though this is just for a prospect, the benefits of completing something like this to this level of detail are pretty significant. And I think the biggest benefit is that should you win the prospect and should they decide to become a client, then all this data that you collected in this phase of the sales process, that is what's going to give you the justification, the rationale to, again, let's find some more revenue opportunities here, right? You'll give you the opportunity to charge for maybe an upfront project work that might have to be done at the beginning of the client engagement. If you feel that there's some high, very important issues that have to get remediated very quickly that you uncovered before you can actually implement your true managed services contract. Through the risk identification, through the analysis, hopefully you have uncovered issues that need to be remediated and resolved sooner rather than later. And so by turning those action items into an upfront project, not only are you going to create some quick revenues at the outset, but you're also, which I think more importantly, going to reduce the risk window for both you and your customer right away. And that's really your goal, is to get these risk issues, these concerns resolved as quickly as possible, right at the beginning, ideally, instead of just making it just a natural part of the package and working on resolving them, slowly over time through the natural course of your services engagement. Your goal with this is to bring the network up to an acceptable, safer level of risk prior to you starting your managed services monthly contract. So conducting an assessment and completing this upfront project, that's what's going to help create that appropriate baseline, that secure baseline moving forward. And if we can reduce that risk window by implementing this upfront project right at the beginning, that's going to help reduce the risk exposure, not only for your customer, but for yourself as well. Because once you sign them on as a client, you are in fact inheriting all of their risk and becoming responsible for that risk. And having collected all this data, as I keep saying, that's what creates your urgency in the sales process to hopefully help you close deals faster than if you didn't leverage any sort of assessment process. And this is what's going to be needed to kind of help when you're putting your ROI together, for the next and final stage of the sales process, because you're going to need it to help justify why you're charging what you're charging and why you're different from maybe their MSP who might not be charging near enough what you might be charging. So the importance of kind of going through the CIS controls, using them to map to your cybersecurity risk assessment process, very important, because as I keep saying, and if you've attended any of Lewis's security nerd, you can't defend what you don't know about. And so the CIS controls, that is that wonderful foundation that we can use to help get that full understanding of the prospect's network environment so that we know what they have, what the current state is, so that you can put a plan in place to monitor, remediate, and correct and maintain moving forward. And if you don't follow these steps for each new prospect that you engage with, then you really are going to be blind to the amount of risk that your prospect may possess. And that's not a good situation for you as their new MSP or for them. And so just to kind of bring this full circle and to wrap things up, really at the heart of it, vulnerabilities exist in your prospects network. They're always there. It just takes someone to find them. And then that's why it's so important to conduct a comprehensive assessment like this of your prospects network including it as part of your pre-sales process so that you can find and identify these vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. Because if their existing MSP hasn't found them yet, there's a reason why they haven't found that yet. And so this is what's then going to allow you to put together that proposal, that compelling proposal, where you can then outline your findings, document your recommendations to help justify the monthly price and why you charge what you do. And the amount of effort that you put into this part of the sales process, I do believe that that's what's going to help set you apart from your competition. This is what's going to showcase and highlight your expertise, your skill sets, your professionalism. And it's what's going to allow you to charge more for your programs and get those 60, 70, 80% contract margins that, you know, our best-in-class MSPs are garnering for their security programs. And then post-sale, your recommendations, your remediation plan, that's what's needed to form the basis for, again, that upfront project that I talked about. You know, if you need to raise their network and security infrastructure standards to meet your standards. And it's also going to form the basis of your tech roadmap that you're going to be using, which actually forms a very key part of your executive review process. So yes, it is going to take some time going through everything that I talked about today. But that's only if you're not doing anything like this today. But I do feel that if you put that process in place, continue to refine it, work on it, make it your own, it'll become less time consuming, especially if you're able to automate a lot of that stuff. But that's why I recommend that you do charge for something like this, because you are putting a great deal of research analysis into this stage of the sales process. But you're also providing them with a wealth of data and insight into their risk exposure that maybe their existing MSP isn't giving them. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And though if they do end up becoming a client of yours, as I was mentioning kind of earlier on at the beginning, you can figure out a way to cover those costs, right? Like you can end up waiving it all together if they become a client, because the lifetime value now, if you sign on, you know, a $200 per user program and, you know, they're signing on for 3 to 5 years, yeah, we can waive the assessment fees, or maybe we amortize it, or we give them a credit. Like there's creative ways that you can get around that initial cost that you might charge them up front. But again, regardless, I do feel that the assessment process is a fundamental component of your overall sales process, because that's really what's going to give you all the information you need to help motivate the prospect to sign with you. All right, so just kind of some next steps, some takeaways. I know I went through a lot in this boot camp. This particular one wasn't recorded, but you can go into Enable You. You can, you know, fast forward me, pause me, you know, go to the section that you want, retake it again, forward it on to anybody else that you would like. If you haven't downloaded any of the documents there, make sure that you have downloaded them. And if this is something that you're not really doing today, find those friendly customers, especially if you're also not in the habit of doing executive business reviews. This is where you can really refine your pre-sales by working on your post-sales and your account management, and use your existing clients to kind of fine-tune that process. And then part 3 is taking place next week, I think March the 6th. I'll bring up the QR code if you haven't registered for that yet. And part 3 is really what kind of brings this all together. You know, how do you put that proposal together? How do you, you know, negotiation strategies, closing strategies, how do you handle the different objections so that you can hopefully win that client? And then if you haven't heard, I have started a new sales and marketing book club. You know, lead gen, NCA continues to be a big struggle for MSPs. I've heard it from MSPs where their marketing is not working and they don't know why their marketing is not working. So in 2025, I have started a book club. And we held our first meeting a couple of weeks ago. The next meeting is coming up March the 25th. There's the QR code to register for that. And we're talking about the book, They Ask, You Answer. Wonderful book, you know, for, you know, if you're involved in the marketing, or if you're, again, looking for ways to differentiate yourself, get good quality, high quality prospects, help speed up your sales process. A wonderful book by Marcus Sheridan. So I'm about 75% of the way through it right now. Love it, love it, love it. Looking forward to talking about it to our book club members in a couple of weeks. All right, well, thank you very much for sticking it out with me. I said from the beginning this was a long one. It was a long one, but really appreciate it. Any questions out of this, there's my contact information there. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Would love to hear from you. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great week. Take care.